They laughed when Maren Solvik dragged that old trunk out of the collapsed barn. Not a chuckle, a real, open-mouthed laugh, the kind that carries across a dirt road and settles into your bones. We want you to picture the scene for a moment. A young woman, 22 years old, standing in the mud outside a burned-out homestead on the edge of Clearwater Flats, Alberta. No family left, no money to speak of, and she's got a rope looped around a water-damaged steamer trunk that looks like it hasn't moved since Confederation, hauling it inch by inch toward the road, while two men on horseback watch from the fence. "Leave it, girl," one of them called out. "Junk's junk." She didn't answer. She just kept pulling. That trunk was the reason people in Clearwater Flats talked about Maren Solvik for the next 30 years. Not because of what she found inside it, though that part matters too, and we'll get there, but because of everything she had to become just to earn the right to open it. This is that story. And we think it's one worth sitting with a little while. Maren had come to Clearwater Flats the previous autumn, in the back of a mail wagon, with $17 and a canvas roll of bookbinding tools that had belonged to her teacher, a woman named Agnes Burr, who had run a small bindery out of her kitchen in Red Deer until she died of pneumonia in September. Agnes Burr had no children of her own. She had taken Maren in at 14, after Maren's father remarried, and his new wife, a woman named Lottie, who wore her resentment like a second coat, made it quietly clear that there was no longer space in the house for a girl who wasn't hers. No dramatic scene, no shouting. Just a morning when Maren's bag appeared outside the bedroom door, and her father didn't meet her eyes at breakfast. Agnes didn't ask too many questions. She gave Maren a corner to sleep in, a bowl of porridge in the morning, and something to do with her hands. Bookbinding is patient work. You learn to score a crease without tearing the paper. You learn to apply just enough pressure. You learn that if you rush, you ruin it, and that the only way to fix a ruined spine is to start over from the beginning. Most problems, Agnes used to say, pulling a length of linen thread tight against her thumb, are binding problems. You just have to figure out what's come loose and sew it back. Maren had learned to bind not just books but ledgers, journals, legal documents, hymnals. She was good at it. Better than good, Agnes told her. She had the hands for it, steady and precise, and the disposition too, unhurried, observant, not easily discouraged. When Agnes died, she left Maren the tools. The canvas roll held a bone folder, 3 awls of different gauges, a wooden sewing frame, 2 curved needles, a small brass-handled knife with a blade worn thin from years of use, and a pair of bookbinding clamps that Agnes had gotten from her own teacher and never replaced because, as she put it, good tools don't wear out if you treat them right. There was also a short letter tucked under the clamp. "You know what you're doing. Go somewhere and do it." So Maren came to Clearwater Flats, because she had heard there was no proper bindery for 60 miles in any direction, and because the mail wagon was headed north, and she only had enough money to go as far as north would take her. She found a room above the feed merchant's storage, cold in October and colder in November, and she put up a hand-painted sign in the window of the general store. "Book blending and digament repair, Maren Solvik." For the first 3 weeks, no one came. The town of Clearwater Flats ran on 2 things, the grain elevator and the goodwill of a man named Aldous Carver. Aldous Carver was not the mayor. He was not the magistrate. He was simply the man who owned the largest parcel of land in the district, who had extended credit to half the families in the valley, and who sat at the head of every important table whether he'd been invited or not. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with a voice like a door dragged over gravel, and he had the particular habit of powerful men in small places. He decided things without appearing to decide anything. Businesses succeeded in Clearwater Flats because Aldous Carver said nothing against them. They failed because he did. He had decided, without explanation, that a young woman running a bindery out of a feed merchant's storeroom was not something the town needed. He mentioned this, casually, to the right people. A hardware merchant who had been about to ask Maren to repair his order books found a reason to postpone. The minister of the Presbyterian church, who had a stack of deteriorating hymnals, was told by a deacon on Carver's payroll that it might be better to send them to Edmonton. A school teacher who had already spoken to Maren about rebinding 30 worn-out readers came by the next day looking at the floor and said she'd changed her mind. She was sorry. Maren understood what was happening. She wasn't naive. But understanding something and being able to stop it are different problems entirely. She survived the first winter on almost nothing. She took in mending when she could get it. She did laundry. She ate a great deal of oatmeal and not much else. Her savings ran down to $4 and then to $2, and then to a handful of coins she kept in an empty tin on the windowsill and tried not to count too often. She kept her tools clean. She kept her skills sharp. Every evening she practiced on whatever paper she could find. Old newspapers, flour sacking, pieces of brown wrap from the general store, stitching and folding and pressing until it was too dark to see, and her fingers ached from the cold. She did not go home. There was no home to go to. The collapsed barn sat at the north end of a homestead claim that had gone to the bank 2 winters before. The family who had worked it, a husband and wife from Manitoba, and their 4 children, had simply disappeared one morning, loaded their wagon and left, and the land had sat fallow ever since, while the bank in Lethbridge argued about the paperwork. No one had been on the property in over a year. Part of the roof had come down in an ice storm. The door hung open. Maren walked out there one afternoon in March, not for any particular reason except that the light was good and she needed to think, and she had gotten into the habit of walking when she needed to think. She wasn't looking for anything, she was just walking. But she went into the barn, the way you do when a door is already open and the place is already abandoned and there's no harm in looking. The light came through the broken roof in long cold columns, full of dust. Most of what was left inside was beyond saving. Rotted harness leather, a rusted plow blade, a stack of feed sacks that mice had long ago claimed. But against the back wall, half buried under a collapsed section of shelving, was the trunk. It was a large steamer trunk, cowhide over wood, the leather cracked and salt-stained, the brass hardware gone green. One of the hinges was bent. The hasp was broken. It looked, to be honest with you, like the kind of thing you'd step over on your way to something else. Maren stood there looking at it for a long moment. She thought about Agnes Burr, who had once bought a box of ruined ledgers at an estate sale for 50 cents and spent a winter rebinding them and sold them for $8 each to a law firm in Calgary. Agnes's philosophy had been simple. Other people's assessment of what's worthless is often the best indicator of where the value is. Maren found a length of rope in the rubble. She looped it around the trunk's iron handles, and she started to drag. It took her the better part of 2 hours to get the trunk to the road. The ground was still half frozen, which meant the rope bit into her palms through her gloves, and the trunk kept catching on stones and frozen ruts. She fell twice. She got up twice. The 2 men on horseback who passed and laughed at her were hired hands from one of Carver's properties. She knew them by sight. She didn't acknowledge them. By the time she got the trunk to the road, she was too tired to feel embarrassed. She arranged for the mail wagon driver to help her load it onto his rig for $1, and he brought it back to her room above the feed merchant's storage, and together they got it up the stairs without anyone's back giving out, which felt like a miracle. She set it in the middle of the room and sat on the floor across from it, just catching her breath. The hasp was broken, but the trunk was locked from the inside, which meant either there was a latch mechanism she couldn't see, or something had warped the wood so badly that the lid had swollen shut. She tried the brass-handled knife from Agnes's tool roll. She tried the awls. She worked slowly and carefully along the seam, feeling for give. She found it after about 20 minutes. A secondary wooden latch, the kind a craftsman adds to a trunk when he wants to be certain the contents don't shift in transit. It had been latched, and then the whole frame had warped around it, and over time the wood had essentially locked itself. She worked the blade in gently, angled it, applied steady pressure. The lid gave. Inside, packed in waxed canvas to protect against moisture, were books. Not ordinary books. Ledgers, 6 of them, cloth-bound, their spines faded but structurally intact. And beneath the ledgers, wrapped separately in oilcloth, a collection of what appeared to be personal journals, 12 of them, small octavo size, the kind a person keeps in a coat pocket. Maren lifted the first ledger carefully. The cover was embossed with the name of a company, Carver & Sons, Land and Grain Co., Clearwater Flats, NWT. She sat back on her heels. She opened it. The entries were in a precise, cramped hand. Columns of figures, dates going back 15 years, property transactions, grain payments, mortgage recordings. Ordinary ledger content at first. But as she turned pages, she began to see the pattern that someone had taken great care to hide in plain sight. Numbers that had been entered twice, once in the ledger and once in a parallel column with a small mark in the margin, a tiny caret, almost invisible. The marked entries were all different from the unmarked ones. Sometimes by a small amount, sometimes by a great deal. The journals were worse. They had been kept by the homesteader who'd left, a man named Peter Calloway, and they described in plain and sometimes furious language the years-long process by which Aldous Carver had manipulated grain prices reported to the bank, inflated mortgages on properties he had helped to value, and quietly ruined anyone who questioned him. The Calloways had figured it out, finally in the autumn before they disappeared. Peter Calloway had gathered every scrap of documentation he could find, packed it into the trunk, hidden the trunk in the barn, and then fled with his family in the night. But not before sending a letter to a lawyer in Lethbridge explaining where the trunk was and what was in it. The letter, Maren found, was still in the trunk, still sealed. It had never been sent. We want to stop here for a moment, because we think this is the part of the story where it would be easy to assume that everything simply fell into place. That Maren took the documents to the right people, the truth came out, and that was that. That is not what happened. Not exactly. Maren was a 22-year-old woman in a town that belonged to the man those documents were about. She had no standing. She had no money. She had no connections. She had $4 in a tin and a set of bookbinding tools and a room she was behind on paying for. What she had, and this is the thing we keep coming back to, was patience, and the particular kind of clarity that comes from having already lost everything once and survived it. She did not rush. She spent 2 weeks reading through every page of the ledgers and journals, cross-referencing dates, making careful notes on the back of brown paper with a pencil she kept sharp. She was a bookbinder. She understood documents. She understood how entries were structured, how a careful hand could bury a discrepancy inside a column of accurate numbers, how a margin mark could be innocuous on one page and incriminating across 100. She mapped it all out. She made a second copy of her notes, in case the first was taken. Then she wrote to the lawyer in Lethbridge, not the one Peter Calloway had written to, who might by now have some arrangement with Carver, but a different one, a woman named Theodora Kell, who had been mentioned in one of Calloway's journal entries as someone who had tried to represent a family Carver had driven off their land, and who had apparently been furious about losing the case. She sent the letter with a teamster she trusted, not through the local post. Theodora Kell replied in 10 days. What followed took 3 months, and we won't walk you through every step of it, because some of it was slow and complicated and involved a great deal of correspondence that is difficult to make interesting. But the shape of it matters. Theodora Kell brought the ledgers and journals to the attention of a federal land inspector who had already been looking into irregularities in the district. The inspector had wanted evidence. He had been looking for evidence for 2 years. What Maren had found in that trunk was not just evidence. It was a complete record, kept by a meticulous man who had understood what he was documenting. Aldous Carver was arrested on a Thursday morning in June. He was brought out of his house by 2 officers of the Northwest Mounted Police, while most of the town watched from the road. He did not look at anyone as they led him to the wagon. The properties he had fraudulently foreclosed on were subject to legal review. Several families who had left the district were contacted. Restitution proceedings began. The bank in Lethbridge, embarrassed and anxious to demonstrate its good faith, paid Theodora Kell's legal fees and quietly settled with Maren for the value of the documents she had recovered, which under the relevant statutes constituted material evidence in a fraud case of this scale. The settlement was not a fortune, but it was enough to pay for a proper space. A workshop with a north-facing window and room for a long table where the light was good for close work. Enough for a proper sign, painted by a man in town who owed her a favor by then, because word had gotten out about what she'd done, and owing Maren Solvik a favor had become, rather quickly, the sensible position to hold. She kept Agnes Burr's tools exactly where they were. By autumn, Maren Solvik's bindery had more work than she could do alone. Lawyers in Lethbridge sent boxes of documents north by mail, contracts, titles, affidavits that needed professional binding before they could be filed. The schoolteacher came back with the 30 worn-out readers and didn't mention having changed her mind, and Maren didn't mention it either. The Presbyterian minister arrived with his hymnals, a little embarrassed, and she bound them in a dark blue cloth that wore well in cold weather. She took on an apprentice in November, a 14-year-old girl named Bet, who had been working in the hotel laundry and had very steady hands. People in Clearwater Flats talked about Maren differently now. Not kindly, exactly. Small towns don't reverse themselves that smoothly, and there were still people who muttered about her being too bold, too lucky, too something. But they talked about her the way you talk about someone the town has decided to keep. She had become, as one of the older women put it at the post office one morning, useful. It was not the most gracious compliment in the world. Maren, who overheard it, thought it was probably the most honest one. She thought about Agnes Burr often, those evenings when the workshop was quiet and the light was going, and she was finishing the last few signatures before setting her tools down for the night. She thought about the bone folder and what Agnes had said about pressure. Just enough, not too much, No more than the material can take. She thought about the letter Agnes had left her. You. You know what you're doing. Go somewhere and do it. She had gone somewhere, she had done it. And somewhere along the way, between the mud and the frozen ground, and the 2 hours it took to drag a locked trunk to a road while men on horseback laughed at her, she had stopped waiting for anyone to tell her she belonged. She belonged because she had decided to. That was, she had come to understand, the only way it ever really worked. The trunk itself she kept. She reinforced the broken hinge with a brass plate she made herself from scraps, relined the interior with a burgundy bookbinder's cloth, and used it to store finished work waiting for pickup. It sat in the corner of her workshop for years, practical and unlovely, and she never felt the need to explain it to anyone. Though if you asked her, and people did ask, sometimes, she would say the same thing every time. I just thought it was worth a closer look. We leave you with a question tonight, one that we think is worth sitting with the way Maren sat with that trunk. What have you walked past because someone else told you it wasn't worth your time? And what might have been inside if you'd only stopped to look?